Good evening, everybody. We are going to give a few moments for folks to join. In the meantime, I'll say hello, welcome. My name is Katie Mosman-Wadler, and I'm the Executive Director of Heritage Radio Network. That's my dog, Louie, in the background. I am so excited to welcome you all to tonight's event. We are celebrating the new book, American Cider, A Modern Guide to a Historic Beverage by Dan Pucci and Craig Cavallo. Later on, we'll also have Ryan Burk from Angry Orchard to lead us through our tasting. So if you were lucky enough to pre-order a tasting kit, you'll be able to taste some of those very same ciders. And in any case, I hope that you will sip along with us. I know we'll all learn a lot from listening to these folks. And right before we introduce you to our guests of honor, just wanted to share a little bit about Heritage Radio Network. Just want to make sure that you all know that we're a nonprofit organization funded with support from listeners like you and our wonderful partners. We have over 40 shows now about all things food, drink, culture, and agriculture with a mission to improve equity, sustainability, and deliciousness by changing the ways that eaters think about food. You can learn more about us at heritageradionetwork.org or search for Heritage Radio Network on your favorite podcast listening app. Check us out. We do also have a cider show. I got to give it a shout out. It's called Hardcore. You can find it anywhere you listen to podcasts. And just before we officially begin, I'm so excited to thank our wonderful sponsors who've made tonight possible. Huge, enormous gratitude to Angry Orchard and to Bookstore Magic. Thank you all so much. And now, without any further ado, I would like to welcome our host for tonight, Jimmy Carbone. He's the host of Beer Sessions Radio on Heritage Radio Network, which currently has over 580 episodes.
Hey guys, how are you?
Hey,
Thanks
buddy.
for putting the show together, Katie and crew. I think that we've really been lucky. You're right about Cider Week New York. Basically, I started doing Beer Sessions Radio and craft beer in 2010. In 2011, the first Cider Week New York started, and kind of the whole course of the cider episodes that we've done, not only on Beer Sessions Radio, but at Hardcore, seem to have mirrored the growth of cider in New York. And that's been really exciting. And it was actually in 2015, I met Dan Pucci when he was working at Wassail. And that year, I think alone, we did at least 10 cider podcasts. And all of them were guests that were coming into Wassail. So there's been this great arc. And if you listen to the episodes that are on Beer Sessions Radio under Cider or Cider Sessions, we've really covered a lot of things. So this is very exciting. And I have to say that one thing I love about this book, American Cider, and I'm a champion of it, is that it kind of reminds me of when I was younger and learning the industry. There would be, you'd grab a book like LaRousse Encyclopedia when you want to know about the different wine regions around the world. And this is the first time I've actually been thinking beyond the Northeast for cider, beyond New York. And we've had some great talks already, and we're looking forward to talking about the different regions and some of the inspirations for the book with Dan and Craig tonight. So thank you, Katie.
Thank you so much, Jimmy. And I just have to say what an honor it is to have you as our host tonight. You are one of the OGs at HRN, and your show is one of the longest running. I think you might have the most episodes out of anyone. And anyone who drinks beer or loves bars in New York City has probably heard your show. But to sort of have this incredible experience now tying in Cider Week, New York City, getting back together with Dan and Ryan and bringing Craig into this mix for a live event. Some of you may have been at our Newtown Pippin event back on Bogart Street 2-3 years ago. So this is going to be something old, something new. And we're really so pleased about the book, and huge congratulations. I'll hand it over to you, Jimmy. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thanks so much, Katie and Kat and Dylan and Hannah and everyone at the crew at Heritage Radio Network. But ultimately, this is about Dan and Craig tonight. Really, I highly recommend you get the book. It's going to be with me. I actually have it on Kindle, and the different regions that I didn't know about. We're going to talk about some of them tonight. So a big intro, Craig Cavallo and Dan Pucci, authors of American Cider. They're going to be joining me. And I think that the journey that you'll take by reading this book is going to last with you for many years. And finally, we have put cider in a similar place where wine is in terms of having a resource. And it's pretty great. So that's Craig, and there's Dan. Welcome, guys. Thanks so much for being part of this tonight. And most of all, thank you for writing this book. I'd like to ask for each one of you just to give a brief synopsis of your experience working together, because it's almost like you're married. You must have spent, I don't know how many years writing this together and tasting ciders. And why don't you start with Craig? Because you give us a little perspective on working with Dan.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Jimmy, for the intro, and Katie, the crew, everybody putting this together. We're excited to be here, chat about the book. It's a great platform, and thanks everybody for tuning in from all over. It was a joy to work with Dan. We were actually just joking kind of before the call, just sound checking. 10 years ago, Dan and I went on this very lovely romantic trip to Europe, and we joked that it's our honeymoon. But Dan and I met in 2010. We were working in wine in New York City, and our lives have sort of just stayed pretty closely entwined since then. But this book, it came about. Dan asked me to help him. Dan is kind of he's the great visionary here in this thing, and I, through our fortunate friendship, got to join him on the journey. And he asked me to help him kind of like frame the narrative and put some of his thoughts to paper and do some of the research. And that's kind of what got me down the rabbit holes with him. And it was just an immense joy. And Dan's a very patient person and very dedicated and committed and reasonable and smart. And all those things really just shine throughout the collaboration that was about 3 years. We started Dan a few months earlier, but March 2018 were our first conversations about the book. And we started in earnest maybe that fall and started with the Southeast. That was the first section that we did in the book, but it was a lot of fun. And what folks have in their hands or will hopefully have in their hands if they haven't got a copy yet is much different from what we originally submitted. The first draft we submitted in July of 2019, and made a pretty serious bout of revisions before it went to print, so to speak. And we're really happy with what we got.
That's great. So Dan, you to me, you're one of the top cider experts in America. But what did you learn writing this book? I mean, you definitely have a different perspective now than you did 5 years ago, don't you?
For sure. I think the big thing about this book is kind of the many diverse narratives we bring into the book. We found all these really unique stories from the country and kind of highlight them and showed how they're special and how they're unique. I think when we first started this book, we had ideas of like of trying to tell a story about like how cider is different around the country, and but then it's cider is in such an infant stage that wasn't really possible, and instead we found this narrative, this historical and contemporary narratives of people today and in the past who are working and growing and experimenting to improve apples, improve orchards, and to make better cider at the end of the day. So I think some of you saying earlier, some of these unknown regions and these off beaten track places that have a really amazing potential to make really great cider in the years to come. I think we're sitting at a really interesting precipice in cider, in which case we're going to find the next 5 years going to be really exciting. Like 5 years ago, cider was at a place, but now we're light years beyond where we were when we first met Jimmy, and we're going to be 5 years from now, we're going to be way beyond that.
No, it's quite amazing. So let's go by region. One section I liked in the book is your Southeastern coverage, because other than maybe Diane Flint, I had never really thought about cider coming from the South. So let's talk about that. You're covering history as well as geology. What is it about, well, let's say James Creek cider in North Carolina?
So what's interesting about the South is that there's a lot of different voices there in terms of making cider in the apple traditions there. So there's the one tradition which is dates back to like the landed large plantation estates that developed things like Hughes crab and those varieties and that culture of large centralized plantings. And then at the same time, other traditions of these small scale, mostly subsistence farmers who are generally white Europeans who are also engaged in making cider there as well. But then we also have other history. So these two different cultures of people making cider there. But then we also have other traditions of people growing apples. So we have first we have a really amazing tradition of the Cree and the Cherokee people, and other indigenous people who are mostly in Appalachia, the mountains, who quickly adopted apples once they're introduced by Europeans, and when they were forced off their lands and moved westwards, basically Europeans came through and found all these amazing apple varieties afterwards. And Craig can talk a little bit more about the enslaved population there as well. Do you want to talk about that, Craig?
Sure, yeah. And just kind of to back up a little bit, just providing context on how Dan is talking about sort of more diverse voices and narratives that we wanted to try to include in the book, which is really kind of the story of the country and its founding. But there has always been, of course, this dominant culture. And a lot of times that dominant culture is the loudest voice in telling the history of the country. But, we know that that's not the case. The country was built by more than just sort of the landed gentry that Dan was kind of speaking of, who had this one unique experience with cider. They had know-how, they had forced labor, they had slaves, they had people that were working for them and kind of helping them facilitate this one particular style of cider versus the folks more in the mountains with the smaller subsistence farms, just creating a more rugged product. But that's something we wanted to sort of chip away at, is the colonial nostalgia, the narrative of presidents and the landed gentry and the folks that sort of that we're tired of reading about. It's not really the whole story of cider, and it doesn't really serve to take cider to the next level, the next step, the next chapter of history, so to speak. It's important that we focus on these other cultures, and like the slave culture in the South. The Southeast brought with them know-how from farming in Africa, and that's cow and cattle, rice, tobacco, even indigo. A lot of these things that became cash crops for the South on these plantations. A lot of the know-how was taught to the plantation owners, the landowners, by the slave population, and everything save the slaves' labor was kind of just overlooked and ignored and championed from the European, the white culture. But that's not entirely the story. There are a lot of contributions there.
You guys really go deep with it, and I really appreciate it. We're going to jump west. So the frontier ended sometime around 1850 or 1860. And I know that last time we talked, Dan, you wanted to talk a lot about certain areas of Colorado and Arizona. I didn't even know that there were ciders being made. Are they desert regions?
They're desert-like regions, yeah. They have pretty low annual rainfalls. Those areas of the country those orchards are mostly fed through irrigation. Some of them, like the ones in New Mexico and Arizona, some of the ones in New Mexico are fed through acequia systems, which are basically irrigation works, like earthen irrigation works that basically in the 40s probably got some cement improvements to it, but basically haven't really changed much since the Spanish built them in the 1500s. And the Spanish basically built them over top of existing indigenous peoples' irrigation systems. So they're ancient systems. They're going back thousands and thousands of years, possibly. And people still use them today, and they're really fascinating, interesting. But parts of these areas, they're just very different. The orchards are very different, and the ciders behave very different there than we might expect apples to engage with here in the Northeast or out west, something like that. It's just very unique and special. And I think that some of these very arid climates are polar opposites from like the 4 seasons we have here in New York. So it's interesting to see how their cider performs and how it tastes, and it's kind of an extreme example of the impact of terroir in cider making. And on that, I'm gonna ask Craig a question about the nature of terroir in our book, because it's something we like talked a lot about and like had trouble figuring out in terms of how to actually talk about it.
Yeah, we sort of, and actually, Dan, come to think of it, I don't know how we settled on sort of. We brought people into it. So terroir, as we know, is kind of the exploration, the idea of tangible parts of geology or geography, you might say. So you have soil, you have climate, that sort of dictates what things grow well and where. And so we sort of expanded on that, and we took terroir to include culture and people and the decisions that people make and why those decisions are being made, and kind of included that into this terroir. So there's, take cider from Oregon, Portland, Oregon, and surrounding areas, it's sort of where there's such a predominant beer culture. You see a lot of really progressive and forward-thinking cider that's being made. It's much different than you might find cider being made in New England, where there's maybe less of a predominant beer culture. And so these things sort of play off each other a little bit. And there's just the human element of terroir, something that we tried to kind of explore and touch upon in the book.
Here's a different question for you guys. What is something holding back fine cider? Are we waiting for what? More apples to be grown that are what's the challenge for the cider that you guys want to see?
Ooh, good question.
Yeah.
Well, the big thing I'll say in the next 5 years is that in the last 5 years, the big thing we've seen is more planting. So there's more fruit going in the ground that's going to be that's growing, being planted with cider in mind. In that mind frame is going to be a big change in the next years. It's only going to help increase the quality of the product and the volume of quality product out there. But that's not necessarily going to help out people selling more quality product. Just because there's lots of new Dabinet going in the ground doesn't mean that people are actually going to drink that Dabinet. So I think it comes down to, not to be dead horse, but it comes down to better consumer awareness and better consumer confidence in the product. Cider's had a hard time figuring out itself in terms of like getting consumers tuned into it. And I think that in the last few years, we've seen a lot more radical transparency in terms of labeling. Opening one of Ryan's ciders, we're going to drink a little bit here. I'm drinking them already. And like he breaks down all the varieties onto the cider. So you can see this is Dabinet, Gold Rush, and all these other varieties. And it's like that kind of transparency and story behind the products helps differentiate them better and helps create a more united and concise narrative for the products themselves and helps instill more consumer confidence. I don't know. Craig, what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the education is a big part of it. There's sort of cider is a category. It's not a singular thing. It's not one beverage. It's not one type. It's not one style. It's a universe, and it's boundless. As we're continuing to learn more, and we're learning as fast as we're evolving.
And Craig, on that note, let me cut in. So as a particular example, so you and your wife run the Golden Russet Cafe up in the Hudson Valley.
You do?
How is the cider program going to evolve? Because at this point, are you selling everything that you want to sell, or are you starting with a smaller selection of cider? And what are you waiting for from your customers to elevate that?
Yeah. It's definitely growing. When we started, it was much smaller. Navigating relationships and finding out how to get certain cider. Part of what I love about cider is that I deal directly with the producers. We kind of, Jenny, my wife and I, we go, it's an email to the producer. It's cider. It's a lovely thing that it's kind of, it's very intimate. And so in many cases, there's not like a middle human that we have to deal with. But so we can just kind of engage with the cider maker and bring in, people are happy to be on the shelf here. It's a very humbling thing and it's very wonderful. The community's been very receptive and cider makers have been very happy to be part of what we're trying to do here in the Hudson Valley. We're outside of Rhinebeck, but we're finding people pretty receptive to it. I think the book helps, having a book on the shelf that, it suggests that I know what I'm talking about and I do to an extent, but we're continuing to learn and I can't beat that point home enough that there's this constant evolution. But I'd like to see the cider program grow a little bit, as more things, some producers can't ship beyond their state. They're limited in that regard, but for the most part, New York, it's kind of infinite and we're happy to bring in as much as we can and, have a conversation with the cider that we're selling with our guests.
Well, I'll tell you, if I were putting together at a really good restaurant like Gramercy Tavern, I would definitely just use your book, American Cider, as a guide. I'd be like, well, I have to get all these ciders. Blue Bee in Virginia. There's so many that you mentioned. But Dan, you mentioned like Colorado, Arizona region and the Southeast. So I think you also want to talk about the impact of climate change on these apples and thus the ciders that you made.
So I think one of the most interesting regions right now for cider is California. California is super interesting for cider. In the last Tillich has been making great cider there for the last decade, but in the last few years, cider has really turned the page there. As especially in the natural wine community, people are more willing to embrace different mediums and have really embraced cider as part of their lineups. And so we have a lot of highly skilled and very knowledgeable fermenters kind of looking at apples in a different way and kind of turning out with some really fantastic and great products coming from California. And while their apple varieties are mostly mainstream eating varieties, or in Sonoma County especially, it's mostly packaging varieties, things like Rome and mostly Gravensteins. And they don't have the same, they generally don't have the amount of diversity that we have here for apples, but the quality of the people making them talent of people making them is really high. So the quality is becoming very, very good. And part of that is because of climate change. The forest fires the last few years have made grape harvests really challenging in California. And grapes get smoke taint and apples don't get smoke taint. So apples are a more, there was a big Instagram fight today about apples and Pinot Noir. And apples are a very sustainable, they don't need irrigation, unlike grapes in most cases. And they're a very different crop. And I think that California is realizing that they need to make changes how they do agriculture because of the forest fires and because of the drought. This year looks like it's going to be a really rough year for them, and it's going to be a big turning point.
Wow. I'll say, let's bring it back to New York State, since that's how we first started talking, and that will lead us on to our tasting and talk with Ryan Burk. What about New York State are you excited about? Because, Cider Week New York started here in 2011.
All of it. New York is a very dynamic place. It's the home of commercial apple growing in the country, actually here in the Hudson Valley. Some of the earliest orchards that were planted for at commercial scale for fresh eating, of course, are from right across the river in Esopus and here on the east side of the river. But there's a long history in the Hudson Valley of growing fruit. The climate here is warmer than New England competition, so fruit from Hudson Valley kind of set the price for the market, and we had the city, New York City, was kind of a developing market and home for some of these apples. Not to mention shipping from the Hudson River, and apples since the 19th century were being sent to Europe. But on that foundation is a lot of modern cider makers just using these existing infrastructures to just really push cider to the next level and just make really, really dynamic, compelling cider. There's a lot of great know-how. We have the benefit of Cornell and a lot of the research that they're doing. It's a few hours away in the Finger Lakes, but the research, it touches all parts of the state and beyond. And that proximity is just a real benefit and push for cider making here. But I think the next few years, like Dan says, there's new fruit going in the ground. People are continuing to learn. And Dan always points out that cider 5 years ago is far different than it is today, and that only that trajectory is going to continue. And in 5 years from now, we're going to be drinking things that I think are going to continue to push boundaries. But in no way are we chasing a certain goal. There's no finish line. I think we're chasing better and better cider, and we're continuing to learn. And with community and context and understanding and education and transparency, I think we can get to a really, really amazing place with cider.
And one thing, so this is about the book as well. Who did the illustrations? I think that the maps are really cool.
So good.
Jim Sly, he's a New York sommelier. His post-COVID business is doing online wine classes called the Children's Wine Atlas. I'll put it in the chat, but it's an amazing, crazy thing he does. He draws. So I talked to him before he blew up, which is great, and got him to do the book. This is like our Midwest map. They're so amazing. They are so amazing and so detailed. They're kind of like young adult. They're kind of like, I thought of them as like very Tolkien-esque young adult fiction kind of thing. So he does kind of like not accurate perspectives and things like that, which are great. And I think are really good. They're really good narrative maps. They tell the story we want to tell.
No, they're great. And they really highlight whatever is the geological structures. You got mountains and lakes and
yeah. And it was great.
Cooling and climate.
It was great to work with a designer, an artist who also is a sommelier. So he understood exactly how to do this thing. And he's from Grand Rapids, Michigan. So he had this personal connections to all these places. And it was really great to he's like, it's really different to do this map than So it was great working with him. I really enjoyed it.
And I want to say to the audience, I'm underselling these guys because Dan's smiling now. This book is a labor of love, and you will love it. And
the maps are amazing.
The maps are fun, and Dan's smiling about the maps. You had some really great people, and I just want to. There's going to be a Cider Myth break coming up, so I just want to thank you guys for having me. I'm going to step off soon, and thanks to Craig and Dan for taking the time to speak with me. To the audience, if you want to hear even more of this thread, recently on Beer Sessions Radio, episode 580, I had Dan and myself with Eleanor Legere from Eden Specialty Ciders in Vermont, and David Thornton of James Creek Cider House in Moore County, North Carolina. And we really did talk more about the regional differences. So I've had a head start, but I've still got a lot to. I think I never want to know more than Dan and Craig. But what's great is I know that they keep learning, and I feel like by the time I read this book, they're going to be ready for the next one. So thank you guys so much, and just stay tuned. We're going to cut to the Cider Myth. There's a video, and then we'll be back with Ryan Burk and Dan and Craig for more. Okay, so thank you guys. Thank you.
Okay, here we are, busting myths in the ciderverse. It is often said and therefore believed that Prohibition killed cider. That's not the case. The country was in a cultural shift. You can't just say one singular thing killed cider. It was too ingrained in the American culture to say one singular thing was at fault. So that alone says Prohibition couldn't have killed cider, really. But to back this up, cider was out of the norm, and it wasn't being commercially produced into the 1920s. It had died, we'll say, about, 1840. The election of William Henry Harrison, cider was viewed as a nostalgic product already by then. The country was shifting from one of a rural and agrarian subsistence-based economy, and it was moving to a market-driven economy. There was more mobility, transportation was increasing, means of production was increasing. The Industrial Revolution brought about huge market sweeps that kind of started to bolster the economy, and this brought people to urban centers or developing urban centers like mill towns and the like. People were leaving the countryside, and that, of course, is where apples grow.
Hey, Ryan Burk here, head cider maker at Angry Orchard, and I'm here today to dispel some rumors about cider making. One of the common myths that we as cider makers hear all the time is that cider is brewed, but I'm here to deliver the final message. Cider is not brewed, it is made. It is much more like winemaking than it is like brewing beer. So there's no boiling. We take fruit, we grind it up, we press it, we extract the juice, and we ferment it. There's no brewing process in any of that. Then we pitch yeast and things move on, and it becomes much more like wine than it ever does like beer.
We're here to bust some more cider myths. This next myth is about Johnny Appleseed. Johnny Appleseed is a beloved American folk hero who actually was a real person. But his overall impact into modern apples is probably overblown. He was a land speculator, an orchardist, and general wanderer in the early 19th century who planted a lot of seedling orchards across the expanding frontier of Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. He basically planted orchards ahead of where white settlers were settling, so that when he bought lands and acquired lands there, so eventually when Europeans arrived to settle shop where he had land there, he was able to sell them trees. Important thing to notice here is he was growing mostly seedling varieties to people, and these seedling varieties were, when you grow an apple from seed, the quality of the apple you get is unknown. It's a total crapshoot. So what ended up happening is he sent a lot of apples to people that may or may not be very good, and probably were only suited for making cider with, and didn't actually contribute to the dominant culture of apple and orcharding we have today.
Another common myth with cider making is that cider has to taste like apples. thing is, it doesn't. It certainly can, and there's lots of cider that's very apple forward, but cider really can't be contained by the way apples smell or taste as you understand them from eating them. And even really what the juice tastes like when it comes off the press. Cider can be so many different things. We really don't have a lot of rules. We can kind of make it whatever we want it to be, which is one of the things that makes it so great. So you can have cider that smells like fermentation, smells like hops because you put hops in it, that smells like barrels, that has no apple character at all and is something totally new. So it's really one of the things that I think makes what we do so interesting and fun and keeps me excited from year to year to make more cider. So cheers.
Hello.
Hello.
Welcome.
Welcome. These are great.
Thank you so much.
I already drink half of them.
Good. I'm glad.
That video was a lot of fun.
It's very warm in here, so I'm like just drinking cider because it's very refreshing.
Yes, the brewing of cider, my favorite topic of all topics.
I figured you like that one.
Yeah.
That's like my
Myth busted.
Yes.
Yeah, I think we need to have like stickers next time. Like,
So what are we tasting?
I'm drinking the Trois Pommes.
Trois Pommes.
Trois Pommes.
Yeah, Trois Pommes is a super fun project. It's one of several ciders that we've laid down method champenois, although we call it method traditional. We try not to tread too heavy on the French and their norms, mostly because they would sue us.
Good reasons.
So yeah, and it isn't method champenois, right? It is a traditional method that they've just sort of claimed as their own, but certainly dates back before the method champenois, but it's certainly made famous by the method champenois. But we treat it in the same way. For anyone that knows how champagne's made, we'll ferment cider and then ferment it to dryness, and then we'll re-ferment it in the bottle and leave it in the bottle for a period of time, and then eventually we'll flip the bottles over and we'll get all the yeast to collect in the cap and blow the yeast out and then cork and cage it, keeping that carbonation. And so what you have is a dry and sparkling cider that has both hopefully varietal characteristics and also some interesting yeast contact character or lees contact, which is for me what's really interesting about it, is that we can really drive that leesy character in a cider the same way that champagne does. And we were joking before we got on the call that we can deliver, at least for the price point, we can deliver bottle for bottle. Cider can compete in the same space that I think some of the great champagnes, at least some of the great grower champagnes, the play in. And I'm proud of that as a cider maker. And I think there's a lot of people sort of driving at that as like, okay, well, we aren't wine. It's cool to like talk about how we're similar to wine, and it serves us well to do that, but we aren't wine and we are cider, and we can do some of the same things that wine does. And I think sometimes we can do them better. And that's sort of doing this method traditional ciders are sort of explore that. And so the Trois Pommes that you guys have is a blend of 3 different apple varieties, the Baldwin, the Newtown Pippin, and Northern Spy, all fermented separately, then blended together, and then through the champagne process. And yeah, I think it's super expressive of those ciders fermented apart. And I think it's an interesting blend. We've also done each one of those varieties single variety, and we're disgorging them kind of as we decide it's right. So right now, the only vintage that's out is the one that we're drinking. We haven't released the Newtown Pippin, the Baldwin, or the Northern Spy yet, but we're starting to disgorge them as they're ready to go. And we just decide that based on how they taste. So what'll be really interesting one day will be to taste things that have been disgorged at different moments and really see, what we've done and where it can go. And we continue to lay them down when there's a good vintage. So it's a fun project.
Ryan, do you have what are you using for the secondary fermentation in the bottle? Are you exploring different things? Or are you kind of going for like one particular?
Yeah, one particular. We're keeping it all the same. I like, we do all kinds of different things, but with this particular project, we're keeping it the same year on year so that we can, explore the constants and not have something like totally throw off, what we've done. So we're just using, champagne yeast in the secondary fermentation just to keep it, sort of singular that way.
Sure, groovy.
There's a question in the chat too about lees.
Yes. Yeah.
Ryan, you want to explain to us what lees are?
Sure. So lees are the dropout from fermentation, essentially. So it'll be there are several different like kinds of lees. So like there's the gross lees, and they're not gross, but it's the bulk lees. And so when you do your first fermentation in a tank or in a barrel, everything that kind of falls out after fermentation, it'll be, in our case, apple particulate. It'll be dead yeast cells, basically those two things. Maybe some tannin, depending on the varieties. And it all kind of drops out and collects at the bottom. And so usually you'll leave that behind. So you would pull the cider off the gross lees, and that would be, run to the drain. And then you still will have particulate. You still have yeast, you still have apples. And so it's mostly yeast at that point, and we call that the fine lees. And so when you bottle, if you bottle that cider, that will be in the bottle. Plus you'll add some more yeast to get a new fermentation. And here you can see some fine lees. Yeah, if you guys did purchase the cider shipment, then the next bottle will has all the lees in the bottle. And so it's fine. It's apples and yeast basically. And it's, harmless, and actually it can taste quite good. And what's cool about it is it also injects character into cider when it's done right, and wine when it's done right. And it can actually be something, lees character and contact can be something that defines high price points and excellence. So it's fun to kind of explore what that little, essentially it could be looked at as garbage, depending on the cider maker. When you utilize it, it actually can be something that adds structure and body. It can protect the cider for long-term storage. So it's a really interesting medium to play with. And you see it, for instance, like sake, the lees will be preserved and cooked with. Not something that we normally do in the US with lees, but wouldn't it be interesting if we took a look at like cooking with cider lees? I don't know. I've never done it, but now that I've said it, I think I will. It could be really fun.
There is a salami maker in Maine that makes naturally fermented salamis from cider lees.
That's cool. Yeah, we actually have done with Jasper Hill, which is one of my favorite creameries up in Greensboro, Vermont. We've done a couple cheeses where we did a cider soak, like straight cider, and then we did just lees. And the lees washed cheese is like mountains, just planets beyond the just cider. That's all the complexity and nuance, really, really cool. So yeah, I think it's a cool medium that we like. What you guys were talking about awareness just generally, and it's like another one of those things that we could be talking about and like bringing interest to, and like combining with the culinary world to like come up with something cool and different that you don't really see in other categories.
Was that the Willoughby from Jasper Hill?
The Willoughby, that's right.
Cool.
Very cool.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Another question, chat, but I'm going to come back to that chat question. I think that Trepom here has lots of the amazing lees character.
Yep.
And it's also like within a very nice medium. It doesn't. Champagne can be a lot of texture to it, and this is a much more like accessible, juicy, flavorful, like I can drink a whole bottle of this no problem kind of style of champagne.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't like fully vetted how I say this, so pardon me if it's not a complete thought, but one of the things I really like about cider is one, I like to drink a whole bottle too. We all like to have a good time. We all like to eat and like combine all of that into one thing. And I've been at many tables with you guys doing just that. And I look forward to being at many more of them. In fact, we just were at one at Gramercy Tavern on Friday night.
Hey!
Yeah, and it was a blast. And
Every Friday, maybe?
Every Friday, yeah. What I really love, you sort of hit on it right there, is that like what the ABV of a cider is just an interesting part of cider's story when we talk about how cider can do the same things that wine can do. One thing that wine can't do that cider can do is be as interesting and complex as it is at 7% ABV. Wine can't do that. I mean, there's some like cool things, and I'm like treading in. I got to be careful here, Craig, since you're related to the master of Paquette. But you know, I think this cider is half of the average champagne, and like delivering the same kinds of things. And so when it gets to the point at which you're drinking it and you're at the table, alcohol starts to be less of the story, and what it is, which is beyond alcohol, and the things that we believe that it is, and the things that are interesting about it are beyond the booze part of it. And so you reduction in booze, but same intensity of character, and you know, sometimes tannin and acid, certainly lees, contact, like all the things that are really cool about wine that we find here. We can get them at half the alcohol, or you know, it's just an average statement. But there's something in all that about how we make ourselves separate from wine, but also like take from their success, but tell a new story and about why we're special. Something in there, you know.
It's a good point. Ben, before you go to the other one, the Trepois or Palms is a good example for a lot of things people have been asking Dan and I, and just questions. And Ryan, I'd be curious to see what you think about cider, the potential to age cider, and if you think we'll see that more and more, just because cider is kind of this thing. Largely, the style now is you make cider in the fall, you release it in the spring, and you drink it, and it's maybe like 8 months old. But you know, Dan has a theory that. And it'll vary from region to region, but cider in New York shows best at 18 months to 2 years after it's been bottled. And something like this that's already aged for 3 years, I mean, you can taste like the richness and how lush and the texture. And I see there's potential for it to like kind of hang out and sit around for another, who knows how long. But what are your thoughts on, from a cider maker's perspective, what are your thoughts on making cider to age and where it stands in the market, if it's a thing that you'll see more of or are interested in?
I mean, I'm going into my 12th cider season, and I've been talking about this the whole time. People always asking about it. And when I got into cider professionally, like beer was the coolest thing that existed at that, you know, and like everyone's talking about aging their beers. And so it was a quick transition. People were like, oh, can you age this? And, you know, cider was certainly being sold more like beer then than it is now. And I think like what's interesting is the conversation has evolved to the question that you just asked, which is sort of we're starting to see that things are, and I was like, oh yeah, can I take this and like throw it in my cellar? It's kind of like, well, actually things are kind of better after this period of time. And we're starting to see that there's some regional differences and all that. So yeah, I think as our knowledge and experience as cider makers, as tasters, as enthusiasts, as, you know, restaurateurs starts to get more elevated, I think, yeah, we continue to see more and more of that. I would love to, like, I'll just since we were just there, like Gramercy Tavern has probably one of the best cider lists in America, if not the world. And maybe that's wrong to say when like it's 99% New York State cider, but we are in New York. You know, wouldn't it be amazing if they added a, you know, vintage cider list to that, you know, and like other restaurants would start to pick up that idea. And so like me personally, like, yeah, I make, from a cider making perspective, I make a lot of cider that I prefer people to drink it fresh. One of them's the next cider. I already spent a couple years making that cider before we put it in a bottle. And my preference is that it's drunk fresh because we're going to make more of it.
To buy it again, you mean?
Well, yeah, I mean, buy it again. But also, it's like, it's meant to be drunk fresh. It's a fresh cider. Whereas the the Trois Pommes and some other ciders, you know, they're more, yeah, I have sort of more of an expectation that they'd be laid down, and I think they improve over time. And it's not to say that Supernatural wouldn't, but like my perfect drinking experience is to drink it fresh. So, I mean, I think some of it also comes down to the cider maker letting the drinker know what the occasion is and like how it should be celebrated and what it should be paired with and when and why. It has probably something to do with like what time of the year it's released. Making sure that there's like some information somewhere about how you might enjoy that particular cider, I think helps lead that conversation.
This is the Supernatural, and it is delicious.
So good.
Thank you.
So rosy and floral and crunchy and
that's probably my favorite. That's probably my favorite cider to make now. It's in its third vintage. I shouldn't say vintage because it technically isn't a vintage cider. It's kind of it's a blend of whatever it happens to be. So we kind of have we totally have a taste profile for it. And I actually made this cider blend up in my head while I was in Spain. I was in Asturias, Spain many years ago, and I was tasting single variety fermentations. And I just started to recognize some similar character in apples and in cider fermentations that I was tasting there to ones that I had already previously done in the States. And I just wrote down a list. I was like, this tastes like McIntosh. This tastes like, Yarlington Mill. This is like Gold Rush. And I was just like formulating this in my head. And I was like, this is this kind of blend. And I got back home, and the first year of Supernatural was those varieties, and we kind of hit a taste profile, a flavor profile, an aromatic profile off of those moments I had in Spain. So that's pretty ingrained in my head as to what it tastes like and what it smells like. But now, year on year, if you did happen to age any of it, or you could find some of the older bottles, the variety changes from year to year. It stays pretty similar, but it is different, and it's all a palate-based blending. So Supernatural is one of our most popular ciders. We always run out of it. And when it's time to make more, I just go into the cellar and I start tasting, and I'll be like, okay, that's going to be in Supernatural. This is going to be in Supernatural. 20% of this is going to be in Supernatural. And I'll just sit and blend with my team and just like get into it. And then ultimately we come to it. And so it's a little bit different every year, but it's always pretty in this line. And it's always finished. We will always add some fermenting cider, so it's finished in the bottle. It is pet nat. And just quick sort of funny story about it. The name is, we actually wanted to call it Super Natty. And we wanted to call it that. It just sort of again, I'll tread lightly. We wanted to poke some fun at the natural wine world just a little bit. We love our natural wine friends and family. And love to drink natural wine, but there's also like the cult of natural wine and the sort of the clear bottle with the white label and a black cap and sort of goofy names, and nobody knows who the producer is, and all that stuff that's like wrapped up in it that also actually makes it really fun and exciting and like alluring. And so we were like, well, if wine is natural, then cider is supernatural. And so, of course, in the wine world, or at least the wine world that I know the three of us live in, often we would call it natty wine. So we wanted to call it Super Natty, because if natty wine is natty, then natty cider is super natty. But we actually got a ding from our friends at the Anheuser-Busch Brewing business, and they actually own the word in alcohol for natty for their famed Natty Light. And so we were not able to call it Super Natty, and we had to call it Supernatural. But actually, the beautiful thing about that is it sort of spawned this whole like fun label thing and naming exercise. The Supernatural is the first one. So the Apple Ghost wasn't a thing until we couldn't call it Super Natty. Then the Apple Ghost came around, and then the other side that we'll be tasting is Frankenstein, and similarly, it's sort of in that vein. And we have a few different ciders. One's also called Extra Terroirial, and they're all kind of these little goofy characters. And it's been a ton of fun, and our design team loves it, and everyone on our team is we have little pins for them now. So it's actually turned into like a really fun.
Brilliant.
Thank you, Natty Light.
Do you want to talk to us a little bit about the Cabernet Franc one, the Frankenstein?
Yes. So Frankenstein is called that because it's made with Cabernet Franc grapes. So I love to do collaborative work, especially in fermentation. And so when I look around New York State, I'm like, I try to like, what are the great things? Like I wish a bar would open up in where I live in Beacon, New York, that was just like Riesling, Cabernet Franc, and New York cider. And that was all they poured. That was the only thing, nothing else. Maybe some local spirits, but it wouldn't be necessary. Just those three things. And so like, I love New York. I love the things that we do so well here. And those are three of my favorites. And I really like New York Cabernet Franc. I've developed a like real taste for it. And I think there's some fantastic wine being made here that is really exciting. And so we collabed with Ian Barry, is a winemaker up in the Finger Lakes. He has his own label, Barry Family Cellars. And so this is the second vintage of that cider. We get Cabernet Franc grapes in good year. We actually didn't make it this last year. The fruit wasn't great, but the year before it was, and the year before that it also was. And so we get whole cluster Cabernet Franc grapes. We bring them back to New York, bring them back to Walden at our cider house. We put it in a big stainless steel airtight container, and we fill it with Northern Spy juice. And maybe people on the call know about the Northern Spy, but we don't have enough time to get into it. But it is one of the great apples in the world. And as it turns out, it is a New York State apple. Founded here. And so we, as New York cider makers, really celebrate that apple. And so we fill this tote with Northern Spy juice, and we let the grapes kind of crush themselves. It's airtight, so that it starts to ferment, and the CO2 fills the tote, and it starts to crush the grapes. And that's how we ferment it. Eventually, we'll press off the grapes and extract the remaining wine cider hybrid, co-ferment, and finish it in the bottle. So this, like Supernatural, is Pétillant Natural, so it's naturally finished in the bottle. And I guess it's another moment to highlight, like both the next two ciders, the second, Supernat and Frankenstein, are both with the lees, whereas the first cider, the Trois Pommes, we tilt the bottle over and get the lees out of there. In the case of these two ciders, we leave everything in the mix. So just to further answer that first question about what lees are, you can really see them in the bottle.
Cool. We got a couple questions in the chat here I'm going to go through.
Sure.
First is, Ryan, where do we find these ciders? Where do we find the Angry
Well, if you live in New York, or you plan to visit the Hudson Valley, or New York, it's a quick ride up into the valley from Manhattan, where our cider house is. That's in Walden, New York. And that's the best way to get them. They do find themselves out in the world, but pretty limited, and it's hard to like really direct anybody to them. We'll do dinners at different places around the country. Usually if I go somewhere, it follows me there. And then the other best way is we do have a cider club, which we just started. So it ships to 30, I don't know how many states it is now, 35, 37 states. It's quarterly. That's without coming to visit us. That's the best guaranteed way to find it. And that changes every quarter. It's a really cool club. We always involve interesting chefs, and it's really personal. So I spend a lot of time on it. It feels like constantly now, which is great because it's growing. It's definitely a lot of work on our team's end, but it's totally worth it because everyone that, all of my coworkers are really passionate about what we do, and they just want the cider to be in people's hands. So it's a really cool club, and you can find, if you're interested, you can find out more on our website.
That's awesome. Next question. What is up with no vintages on cider? So I'll start this off. So the TTB, which is the federal government's entity for regulating alcohol, determined back in the 60s that they create a system which grape wines can now have things like vintages, appellations, and things like that, and regulations around how wine is produced. And cider doesn't fall into that. Cider is not made from grapes, therefore it is not allowed to use that system. And if you use that system on your labels, then you are at risk of confusing the consumer to thinking that you're drinking grapes.
But
Except you're not.
and there's ways around it, right? Like Ryan, I don't know what you guys do, but you can kind of say, you can call it batch, like this is batch number 2018 or something.
Well, like on the Schwa Palm here, it does say like bottled in 2018, disgorged in 2020.
Yes, you can say bottled, and you can say bottled. Yeah, and you can, if your cider is below 7%, then you can probably get away with it, but not necessarily. But you might be able to. But most cider that's like a vintage cider is probably above 7%. It gets in the way, and it really, Dan explained like the nuts and bolts of it. But it doesn't actually answer the question really, right? Because it doesn't, not that he didn't answer the question correctly, he did. It doesn't make any sense. And you can vintage beer, for instance. There's all kinds of vintage beer, except when you think about beer, it's unlikely.
The opposite.
It's the opposite. It's unlikely that all the ingredients are from one place. It's almost impossible that they would be. And it's very unlikely that they'd even be from the same year when it comes to grain. That could be from anywhere and at any time. And hops are often packaged and dried and stored and from multiple places, yet you can put a vintage on a beer. So that's the antithesis. So when we talk about confusing people, actually that's one of the most confusing ways you could try to describe vintage to someone, is that it's not vintage at all, but you can say it. So not that we have chips on our shoulder about it. I'm going to start getting mad talking about it, because it's very frustrating when you are making vintage products and you can't describe them that way.
And it also extends in other areas as well. So you also can't list things that are AVAs as well, or wine appellations. So I don't know about your labels, but for a while people were getting dinged for Hudson Valley was getting dinged for a while, because while it was getting passed, now it's getting dinged because the wine region is called Hudson River Valley region.
Right.
But like Finger Lakes gets dinged, is not allowed on the labels.
Yeah, we did. We had Hudson Valley on the front of our labels. We got dinged for that. Now it says HVNY, and no one said anything yet. So hopefully no one from the TTP is on this call.
Abbreviates. And I think you can still list counties. So they can do it. It was like Sonoma County and things like that are allowed on labels now, but you can't list like you couldn't say Russian River Valley or something like that.
Yeah.
We have a question here: is vintage cider a thing you can find in other countries, or is it more contemporary with a longer modern history of cider drinking? So there is a tradition of vintage cider in the UK of drinking vintage cider. Although most of it, again, is probably drunk pretty, like by volume, most cider has always been drunk pretty fresh. Like wine, most time it's been drunk fresh, and traditionally the cider is the same thing. In Spain, I think it's exactly the same as well. Ryan, is there any tradition of vintage cider in Spain? Do you know of?
No, it's a fresh farm drink. It's made to drink fresh, especially the Spanish cider, and you really should drink it as fresh as you possibly can, because it's very delicate and it's just like not built or made to age. I think you find more tradition in the UK just based on, the cider keeps a little bit longer. You have higher tannins, so you see a little bit more of it there. It's same with France. Just speaking of the three main, historically, relevant regions, they also it's really meant to be drunk fresh. It's definitely cider's a fresh drink, and one of the other things that makes it what it is.
Well, there's no value in making it cider's always been the lowest value product, especially in the UK and so like there's no value in making it age longer. I was hearing stories a couple years ago, like in France, the growers are making more money selling it as pasteurized. We're making more money as pasteurized apple juice than turning it into cider or anything else. So like,
Yeah.
they're not gonna like not take cash flow.
Do you see this question, or do I just see this question about acreage in the Hudson Valley?
That came up to mind too. Yeah.
Yeah.
What mixed variety? I was gonna combine those two.
Okay.
Acreage
Right.
variety and favorite apples for blends for cider
I'll
making.
stay out of it.
Well, no. I'm gonna combine them into one question because we're almost out of time here. So favorite app. I think.
Quick adage about Golden Russet, the namesake store, is we found some sort of tidbit, and it was this person had recommended, if you're going to set out an orchard of 1,000 trees, make 999 of them be Golden Russet, and then the rest you can decide for yourself. But Golden Russet, it's good apple. But it's sort of, I don't know, I'd be curious to see what you guys think. There's thousands of varieties, and there's access to, hundreds of varieties from nurseries, but I guess it would depend on the intent of the orchard and the fruit.
Yeah, I think it's hard to pick favorites here because I think there's so much knowledge that we're not necessarily understanding yet. So like, the best is yet to come. So like, I don't. Who knows? Like.
Yeah, and I have some favorites, and as it turns out, I have some land in the Hudson Valley, and I plant apples on it. And I am really excited about, first off, the sort of call them traditional New York varieties, because they grow very well here, and it's interesting and fun to push them in new directions and kind of see what we can get out of them. And so the Newtown Pippin and the Northern Spy are two of my favorite apples to put in the ground, as well as the Gold Rush apple, which is a apple out of Indiana, out of Purdue breeding program. We really like that apple because we can drive the sugar up pretty high, and it continues to improve after it picks generally. So we can get much higher alcohols, and it's nice to have that higher alcohol to blend with ciders. So if you did get the ciders, the Gold Rush pops up in the Supernatural. So I really like that. And then when it comes to high tannic varieties, I've got an affinity for English cider. That's really where I cut my teeth and got when I realized that I needed to make cider, and that this was going to be my life, is when I started drinking English cider in England. And so the Yarlington Mill, which we find grows pretty well here, is definitely one of my absolute favorite apples. And I might just touch on that, like, what's really cool about what we're doing here, and with the really supportive community that we have, and that includes the New York State Cider Association. It includes Glenwood, which is an organization that works to make this a diverse place for farmers, as well as certainly Cornell and all the all the resources and knowledge that they have. We are starting to look at what varieties grow well, and how can we start to build a dialogue, a lexicon around what they taste like, especially, so take an apple and grow it in the Hudson Valley, and then take that same apple on the same rootstock and grow it in Buffalo or the Niagara region. And can we start to tell a difference if we grow it the same way on the same rootstock from the same nursery? Can we tell, if we start to measure year on year, what it tastes like, what it smells like, what the cider is like? Can we start to define regionality in a real way that kind of gets us out from under that wine AVA or that non-vintage thing that's in our way? It's a cool thing about New York State and the cider community here. We're really leading the charge on that and that conversation. Everyone on this call is a part of it. It's interesting stuff. So what all our favorite varieties are today could very well change as the time goes on.
Yeah, it's very exciting to see what's going to happen the next few years. Scott, a question about New Mexico. I think New Mexico is really cool. Like, there's a whole book called The Cider Maker Rio Oscuro, which is a book I have. I haven't actually read it yet, but I do own it.
I also have it and haven't read it.
Ellen Cavalli recommended it to me as a book.
So good.
It's all about some nuclear scientists from Los Alamos who grows apples. Doesn't make any. I don't think actually makes fermented cider, but grows fruit and makes sweet cider there. So I assume he says this in the book, but I don't really know what's in the book yet.
I'm cracking up about Matt's question about who's got the better beards, cider makers or brewers. I mean, you guys are repping hard, all of you right now, but I don't know. That's a tough one.
I'm just lazy.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a pandemic tint to all of this facial hair.
Yeah.
Indeed.
I was very shaggy, as you can see in the cider video we did earlier. So.
Well, it's all good. And you guys also, you just brought me back to back when we did things in real life, and we're getting back to that soon. But, Dan, all those apples that you brought.
Oh, the Newtown event. Yeah.
We did this Newtown Pippin tasting and talking
amazing.
about terroir and cider. And you got, like 30 different sources of Newtown Pippin apples.
Yeah, we got 30 apples and like 25 ciders. And like Ryan, I was wasted after all of that.
We all had a really good time cleaning up after that event, but
oh my God,
really looking forward to welcoming you all back in person. And maybe we pick another variety, but the Newtown Pippin is really special because it originates in our backyard at Heritage Radio Network in the Newtown Creek in Brooklyn.
Yeah,
not in the creek, but beside the creek, I suppose. But really incredible experience, and it was great to like go into such a depth with the two of you, and this has been really great tonight. Wanted to just say an enormous thank you to everybody for the conversation. So I'll let you, if you have any last thoughts, I'll let you share those, and then I'll say a couple of more thank yous. But we are coming towards the end of our time.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks everybody for coming here tonight. Hope you enjoyed our ramblings and our delicious cider and our conversation about how things work. And this stuff's really great. I'm really excited for years to come. Like, you guys make it the Walden. I was there the other day. It's totally picking up the cider, and it's totally amazing. They have all this new estate fruit coming online. It's gonna be ready this year. It's really exciting for really cool stuff to come.
Yeah, and don't expect cider to be put in a box. I think we're just continuing to evolve and grow, and it's fun year after year just to see what cider makers are releasing and learning, and it's fun to be a part of it and learn together. It's a very communal drink, and it should be continued to be treated as such.
Awesome.
Yeah, and I just appreciate getting to be a part of this. I'm super proud as a cider maker to have you guys a part of the community, and have written such a great book that we can, we as cider makers can be proud of. Because we really needed something like that. So thank you for that. And yeah, thanks for having me to talk cider. I'm always game.
Awesome. Ryan, hope to come see you in Walden soon. And Craig and Dan, thank you so much. Congratulations on the book, and huge thanks to Jimmy from Beer Sessions Radio for kicking us off tonight. And truly enormous gratitude to our sponsors, Angry Orchard and Bookstore Magic. Thank you all for tuning in. And if you
check out the maps,
look at those beautiful maps. If you enjoyed tonight's event, please check out the rest of our programming. A great way to do that is to subscribe to our newsletter on heritageradionetwork.org and become a member to support our work. And once again, thanks everybody. Thanks for tuning in. If you keep your browser window open, you're going to land on a special page with tons of cool cider content featuring these three guys again, and a bunch of other folks in the cider space. So if you can't get enough, that's a great next step, and we hope to see you all very soon and drink some ciders together. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thanks, Katie.
Thanks, million.